Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Well Said. Today, I've invited back Dakota Wood, Senior Research Fellow of Defense Programs in the Center for National Defense at the Heritage Foundation. Thank you, Dakota, for joining us once again.
Hey, it's great being with you. Thanks. Looking for a great chat.
Yeah. The reason I asked you back is to follow up on our last episode where we discussed weakness through wokeness, where on the 20th anniversary of September 11th, we discussed what the military stands to lose if it goes down the path of identity politics and begins incorporating this kind of Marxist ideology. In light of everything that has happened between then and now, I want to have this conversation once again, but in a slightly different context. So obviously this time more focused on how America's overall political culture and rejection of its founding principles has put us in a really vulnerable position with regards to our enemies and competitors on the international stage, especially with regards to deterrence, which we can talk about in a little bit as well. We've seen how Putin has chosen to deal with a weakening America. So we can discuss why this happened, but I also want to discuss what our other competitors and enemies around the world are seeing when they look at the United States, watch our news, and when they read our social media posts, even the sad attempts at political messaging and like TikTok. So I want to see, when they see videos on YouTube, for example, of like screaming college students who are literally throwing childish tantrums, I want to know what you think about the future generation's abilities to keep our enemies at bay and maintain American prominence. So let's start there. So as often as many things do, like let's look at the college campuses. Dakota, what do you think when you consider our future generation of leaders? Like, kind of, what are your first initial thoughts and what are your concerns?
Yeah, so there's this, I don't know if dichotomy is the right word, but, it would appear to be kind of an internal contradiction of just our system, where we do have this right to speak freely. You can express any opinion you want. Can't shout fire in a crowded theater because of potential damage. But, you know what I'm saying? So we have this ability to do this. But because of that, we can have segments of the population that are just at radically different ends of a philosophical spectrum or political ideology. And we enjoy that freedom. I mean, it really is a strength of the United States to have such a diverse range of views. And yet you cannot forget about or exclude the divisive nature, right? And where it starts pitting people against each other. And really erodes tolerance, I guess, in many ways when you take these extreme positions. So I know it sounds kind of like I'm rambling, but it really goes to the heart of the identity or character of the country, right? And so if you're external to the United States, you have a different system, like, a political Islam in Iran, or if you're in Beijing, perhaps not the Chinese people writ large, all 1.4 billion of them, but if you're the leadership in the Chinese Communist Party, which is calling the shots in China, or if you're among that kind of core group of, it appears to be sycophantic, advisors to Vladimir Putin in Moscow, you look at the United States and we're just in complete disarray, right? I mean, we've lost any kind of grounding in objective truth or objective reality. Witness the confirmation hearings, for the judge that's being considered to be a Supreme Court justice who refused to define what a woman is. I mean, are we really to that point, right? Or this expectation that I have the freedom or the right to choose my gender identity and my preferred pronoun. So I have that right, but you don't have the right, to disagree with that. I impose upon you this obligation to observe my freedom, but I don't have the same obligation to observe yours, right? So it circles back around to this, freedom of speech and kind of chart your own path with really a civic and social obligation to understand how that might affect the various institutions, the fabric of our communities and our culture. And clearly I come to this stuff from a national security military standpoint, and the services are a great example of service to country, team building, a unified, uniform identity, right? Where somebody joins the Marine Corps, or the Army, the Air Force, and you are effectively, signing this contract that says, I am becoming part of this larger organization. The organization has a very defined mission. And so I need to set aside maybe some personal preferences,
Right.
Or things that I think I would want to be able to articulate, because that's the nature of this agreement, right? That there is this greater good that needs to be accomplished. And we need to have,
Right.
a team identity and a common identity and a unified purpose in what we're doing. And I think this discord that we see coming out of colleges and universities, and as you had initially talked about here, these emerging young leaders in different professions. Well, part of leading is not imposing your will on those subordinate to you, or you're trying to get as whatever followers or something like that. It's, what are we trying to accomplish? What's the greater good? And how do we build up, and how do we define ourselves as Americans that really is something different and something unique and something special, on the world stage.
Yeah. And I want to talk about first with something you mentioned towards the end, which is the military kind of, that it's designed to put your personal preferences aside so that you can have this team effort and really focus on the mission at hand. And my biggest concern is that a lot of what we're seeing in not only just with younger generations, but just generally with the woke, and we kind of talked about this in the last episode with this woke ideology, is that it is starting to impose itself on the military, and it's starting to create a situation where service members have to ask themselves, what are my cultural principles? What are the things that I care most and deeply about? And are those more important than the mission itself? And
Right.
so, and then how does that play into, for example, what I'm being told to do? Whether it be for the Defense Department or the commander in chief, or kind of like what that societal influence is. And so I'm curious what your take is on that and kind of what it's looking like right now, because I'm thinking about this in context of, for example, I've heard a lot of stories that coming out of Ukraine, where Russian soldiers don't even really know why they're there. They didn't realize that they were basically targeting Kiev, or if that was even like, that's just like, they were not being told things, right? So are we creeping down this path where service members are not going to be able to have a say at all in the mission itself? Or kind of like, what is because especially if the mission is for some sort of woke ideological like goal, right?
Right. One of the beauties of, at least in the American military model, the civilian control over the military, right? So the military itself is not some independent political entity or a power structure that imposes its will like it is in, Turkey or Pakistan or many other countries, right? That if you're wearing the uniform of the country, you salute smartly and do your absolute best to carry out, the orders or tasks given to you. Does that mean that everybody is some kind of a robotic figure, this automaton that has no individual identity? Well, absolutely not. It's that mutual respect I kind of talked about, or at least implied earlier, where there's an awareness of what the purpose is and the greater good. But the military in our model is exploitable, right? It can be exploited by political powers.
Right.
So if you have an administration that comes into power and they have a particular ideological agenda, right, and they want to impose that, well, if it's within the laws of the land and they're ordering the military to adopt certain practices or teach certain classes, this identity politics or viewing each other through a racial lens, right? Or setting quotas or changing military standards so that we get the outcome that they desire in terms of how the military looks, in gender and race and these sorts of things, regardless of maybe performance, a standards-based performance in a certain area. Well, the military, because of its professional upbringing, is going to try to execute those policies. And if you found military service members that refused, you're creating some real combat credibility problems, that the good order and discipline, that phrase that we often hear about, do people follow orders or don't they, right? Well, those issuing the orders have a responsibility to the force that the policies or the orders that they're giving don't end up destroying the institution and creating division and breaking down teamwork or team identity, right? If you want your soldiers or airmen to view each other through a racial lens, well, how is that unifying in some way? We're supposed to be getting past that, when they pass through the portals of these training centers and all that sort of stuff. So there is a responsibility by the civilian leadership to understand that and account for it. But when they refuse to acknowledge that aspect and they want to impose, the dilemma we create in the military is do you carry out that order? Okay. Right. Now, it can be fairly simple in that if you, the service person or the service leader in the uniform, feel that you just cannot carry that thing out, then you resign, from that position and you go off and do other great things for the country. But wow, what a destructive, effect we can have on the U.S. military. So again, I go back to this idea of mutual responsibility and respect and an understanding of what we might be doing to these institutions through this blind or mindless or uncaring imposition of some of these ideologies. And again, go back to this identity politics, nonsense, right? And it's just a disregard, or maybe I guess we're going to be as positive as we can, lack of understanding of the military world. But if you're coming in as a political appointee, aren't you obligated then to understand the organization, over which you have been given various authorities? And that seems to be lacking these days.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'm a little bit more paranoid than you are about this, but I mean, you seem to be approaching this as a very level-headed and mature take, compared to, I mean, I genuinely believe that a lot of what the progressive left's goal is actually not to unify, it's actually to divide. And if that divisive nature of their movement starts to seep into the military, the concept of unity is not even present in their ideology. It's actually, the goal is to break it all down and rebuild it in their own image, right? So maybe this is part of the bigger picture here. I don't know.
No, I think you're really, talking about some realities here. That the political agenda is more important, right, on their plate. It has a higher priority than the potential damage they're doing to the military itself, right? So just as an example, and this, goes back many years now, if we wanted to normalize, which has now happened in the country, homosexual marriage, okay? The 50 states were a great construct by the founding founders, so that the citizens of each state could elect their own, kind of autonomous, governing structure within the state. But we were all unified in these states under a common federal government, right? But you had these wonderful examples, now 50, of different models, different economic and tax structures and rules for whatever, gun ownership or those sorts of things. So a lot of these things were supposed to remain at the state level. Well, if you come in at the federal level and you have an agenda of normalizing, same-sex marriage, for example, one way to do that is to use a federal organization, right, to pass a rule that would allow that. So now you have two soldiers who are male, they get married in a state where that was legal, at a particular time, but because they're subject to orders to the federal government and they can be moved around the country, it sets up this court contest where do they have, visitation rights and benefits and, does healthcare shared and all those things, irrespective of what the state in which they were assigned, with the citizens of that state. So I'm using that as an example where somebody coming in with this divisive ideology, whatever that might be, right, can leverage or exploit the military as a rules following, salute smartly carried out sort of organization to impose their agenda on the country as a whole and bypass, local interests, the desires or the political will of the citizens of a particular state or even their own governing structure in that state. And so this, to your point now, right, points out how somebody can be so uncaring of the damage that they might be causing and are likely causing in such a critically important organization as the U.S. military, right? That they're trying to stamp their own desires, their political agenda on these organizations to, I think, the greater harm of the country as a whole.
And you say uncaring, which I think is still a little bit more forgiving, because I even think some of it might actually be intentional and part
Yeah,
of this plan.
sure.
But that's me being, my typical like paranoid self. So
Well, I tell you, I mean, as many people come in, they do have different agendas. So you can have truly an American hating individual,
mm-hmm.
who comes through whatever their path was, academia or a political donor or whatever that might be, and they are appointed into positions by presidents, right? And they just don't seem to not only not give a hoot about the country, but they want to change the country. The United States isn't special or unique. The Judeo-Christian basis for our kind of governing structures and cultural value systems and those sorts of things need to be destroyed and replaced with something else, right? So that doesn't pertain to everybody, I mean, that there are different individuals with different sorts of agendas. But what I also try to keep in mind is just the country does change over time. Now, I'm not in favor of a lot of these changes that I see, but I was born in 1963, which seems 200 years ago, right? And so as I grew up, there were certain cultural norms that were in place, and I joined the military in the early 1980s, right? And so it's just kind of a different world. But today, in today's society, if you're an 18-year-old coming out of today's high school systems, what you find normal and everyday in your social media and in your classrooms and in, pop culture and the entertainment industry and all those sorts of things, you bring with you that norm into the military. And that's going to be a different perspective on things than maybe the old general or admiral, who's further up the chain and came in at a different time, right?
Yeah.
So is that good or bad? Well, we can debate that all day long. I'm just saying that it's different. And so as our recruiters go out into the American youth population, they're dealing with a different group of people with different views that have been shaped by these educators coming out of a lot of these elite universities, and they have their own agendas. And these things, I'm sure you've covered, ad nauseum in the various school materials, the books, all the things from elementary school on up, and it is shaping opinions, in a way that is different than what the country enjoyed and really prized not too many decades ago.
Let's talk about this more. The next generation of leaders, I'm really curious kind of what your thoughts are on this, because the level of self-censorship on college campuses is at an all-time high. I think FIRE came out with a report last year that said it was over 80% that students actually admit to censoring themselves on campuses, either whether it be in the classroom or discussing with one another on, through a debate or something, that they hide their beliefs. And they either hide their beliefs or they actually, I think in that case, end up not even developing them or really developing those stronger convictions because they're not forced to defend them. So in looking at that, plus now adding that phenomenon with what we're seeing on the other end of the spectrum, which is that you get these student government association senators, which I've seen this kind of across the board on campuses as I've been looking at them and talking with students. They're kind of on these like tyrannical missions. They're trying to pass policies that really restrict what clubs and other students can say or do, that are very much kind of like, and they're pretty much taken over by like this like woke mob mentality. They want to impose all of these progressive leftist ideas onto the campuses. And so combined with that type of leadership, right? Because that's what's coming out. Those are the students who are going to get put on their resumes that they were, student government president, or that they had, been success. They're the ones who are involved in all these clubs and involved in everything. So they're actually going to see some success probably, down the road. The fact that they're seeking out leadership roles shows evidence that they're attracted to these positions and they're attracted to this way, the style of leadership, whether lack of leadership, right? So I guess my question is for you, kind of what's going on with this convictionless, like middle of the road, keep your head down future generation, but then also the tyrannical, the other side of that the same generation that's kind of going to be, what are we seeing here for the future leadership?
Yeah, I mean, it's the destructive hypocrisy of the progressive left in these matters, right? So sometimes the rhetoric are all the right words, speak truth to power, courage for conviction, stand up to authority, those sorts of things. And somebody in a true leadership position, you would want them to step out, to take the initiative, to chart the course, to hold people accountable and those sorts of things. So these should be positive attributes. Where the hypocrisy comes in is them saying those sorts of things, but only if what you were going to say aligns with their preferred, policy,
Right.
agenda, or ideology, right? So in the old days, and I don't know how old the old days are, but we did self-censor for positive reasons, out of kindness. You go to a church social and eat somebody's macaroni and cheese, and it was horrible tasting. But if the wonderful grandma who made it said, "How'd you like the macaroni and cheese?" "Oh, this is the greatest thing I've ever had," because you were just kind and polite and you didn't want to give offense, right? That is different than what we see today, where there is fear of reprisal, of job loss, of punishment, right, of ostracism on these campuses and in these businesses. How many examples do we need where whatever, some corporate CEO decides to exercise their prerogative, right, their right to provide support to some political candidate, but golly, if it didn't align with the preferred candidate of whoever their woke employee base is, or some influential person on social media, they get bounced by their board and lose their job and their income. The shutting down of speech on campuses. If you bring in one speaker that aligns with the preferred ideology, there's all kind of cheers, and we're going to support this person even if they're controversial in a sense. But if some other speaker wants to come in, really showing an acceptance of diversity of opinions, different view, how many times do they shut down controversial conservative speakers, in preference to progressive liberal? So this is the hypocrisy that I'm talking about. That is damaging. Right. So people who self-censor out of fear and intimidation, the social coercion that comes, a professor that's going to give you failing marks if your paper isn't written in a way that echoes what they would prefer you to write, that's not freedom of speech, right? That's not really accepting diversity of opinion or views and learning from each other. That's repression, and it's the same kind of authoritarianism that we see in these repressive regimes in countries like Iran and China and Russia and others that our military has to deal with, if we want America to stay, free, prosperous, and safe, right? All those sorts of things. So if the new leaders, if student leaders are coming through that system, at what point do they really become aware of a responsibility to entertain, these different walks of life, these different viewpoints? So again, on the military thing, if you're a battalion commander and you've got 800 people in your battalion, you've drawn in these young folks from all over the country, different racial backgrounds, different economic settings, family situations, ethnicities, all these things, and you have to form a team. And so you do this by having a common identity of being a United States Marine or being a U.S. Army soldier, or a space guardian. And you're all there to support the country that you love, that represents something special, that needs to be defended, and to which you have some measure of loyalty, right? Well, if these people coming in have a very slanted, progressive, liberal sort of thing, just like, again, days gone by, if you were this extreme kind of right-wing white supremacist in the true sense, not as being fictionalized by the progressive left these days, but if you were some kind of, robe wearing, racist sort of bigot, well, you wouldn't want those people in there either, right? Right. But I think this, the language we're seeing coming out of campuses is so heated and so extremist that to try to paint everybody who doesn't align with their way of thinking as some kind of an extremist individual, right? And it's just not true. Right. And so it leads to this division and to lack of a coherent identity. And if our new leaders are coming out of that community, it's not going to be good for the military specifically, or for other social organizations, civic groups, or the country as a whole.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about this even more on like a strategic scale. If you have this, for example, kind of these students, they say, I think a study came out not too long ago on Generation Z, Gen Z, I guess is. So they apparently are the most moderate generation at their age, at that age encapsulated compared to other generations, and that they, some people say that that's a positive thing and that they're kind of more accepting and more open-minded. To me, that actually is a negative thing, and that they're not really willing to choose a side. And I think it goes back to the self-censorship issue, where people are afraid to pick a side and they would just rather avoid that altogether and just go middle of the road. And then when I look at kind of the way the current administration has handled the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and this complete lack of decisiveness, where we're going to draw the line, like it's just kind of all over the place. And we've seen this historically as well, how this plays out and how our enemies are going to view this behavior. What happens when we have an entire generation of leaders who are like indecisive, right? Because deterrence kind of relies on these decisive consequences that would follow any kind of action on our enemy, behalf. So,
I mean, you have to pick a side. Ultimately, right? And that picking a side presumes that you have arrived at a conclusion about right or wrong or good or bad or what's of value and what isn't, what could be destructive or harmful. So if in your raising, whether in the family or in the schools these days, there is no objective truth or reality. There is nothing that so defines the United States as being something special and better than other forms of government, right? Or go about sorts of things. So then you're kind of left adrift. And why should you pick a side, right? Because everything is kind of roughly the same, and we want to be accepting of everybody, and we're fearful of saying that something is harmful, rather than being good and positive. So if we have removed that aspect from the raising and the education of our youth, then I don't know how you do pick a side. Right? Because it means that you have to choose. And there are, in a crude sense, winners and losers, things that are acceptable and things that aren't acceptable, right? So when we, do want to trumpet what America has stood for since its founding, why people want to come here in droves, and you don't see a mass influx of migrants to China or Russia, right? Why is that? Why is it that we have had a higher standard of living or more freedom and liberty that is often exploited, and misused? But that's the aspect of freedom, to be able to do that. And like I mentioned very early on, the co-commitment sort of responsibility to take that responsibility and to be aware of what freedom allows you to do and how it can be misused. So if we're not teaching that in our civics education, or in our, evaluation of principles of liberty and democracy and, true acceptance of these sorts of things, then you never do have to pick a side, and so I think that is really the more troubling thing that you have brought up. If you have a company that is headquartered in the United States, but they're accessing a global market, we see corporate decisions that minimize any kind of an allegiance to the United States, because they don't want to get cut off from a 1 billion person market in China.
Right.
So we see Hollywood, for example, heavily influenced by China. We see sports like the NBA, right, that wants to sell lots of jerseys in the People's Republic of China. And so they are very hesitant to talk about human rights abuses, or just horrific behavior by the Chinese Communist Party, because it's all money driven. So they don't seem to have any kind of fealty, or any kind of a sense of desired obligation to put America first. I mean, are you an American, corporate entity, or are you this global entity, which is sheer nonsense? And it reflects this idea of a refusal to pick a side, or an awareness that at some point a side has to be picked. I mean, if you're in Ukraine and you are under assault by Russia, do you step up and fight for your country? Or do you just go ahead and leave and say, well, I can get a job as a baker in France, or go to the United States and be an Uber driver or something like that. And yet we see these people stepping up because it's their homeland, it's their culture, it's their country, and they have identified as Ukrainians under assault by an authoritarian repressive regime that wants to eliminate their identity and reincorporate them into this kind of greater czarist Russia, right? So they are having to pick a side. And just like we need to, pick our friends and, pick a country that we love, or defend a family member or something like that, there comes this point in time in all of our lives where you have to decide what's important to you what battle do you want to wage? And that takes courage. And it's all based on your identifying things that are more important than others, right and wrong, and what is good and helpful and productive, as opposed to things that are destructive.
Yeah. And so I was driving around this small town the other day, and I noticed that there was a house with two flags hanging outside of it. One was, and this is like kind of in the countryside of Pennsylvania, like, where you would expect a lot of like patriotism. And anyway, so it had a Ukrainian flag hanging out, and then an LGBTQ flag with like the 50 stars and stuff, but no actually like American flag. Right. And so what concerns me a little bit, actually a lot, is this extreme loyalty and fealty that I've seen towards Ukraine since the invasion of Russia. Is this an anti-Russia movement? Or like, I'm curious, because Hollywood has like raised millions of dollars for this, the invasion of Ukraine. And they were like, everyone's like flocking to this like pro-Ukraine, anti-Russia rhetoric and all over social media. Would we see the same response if someone invaded the United States? Would we see the same response if there was ever a threat to the United States? Because currently, being in the national security apparatus or, in the defense policy world, you already know there is like a really valid threat to the United States, and that is China. But we don't really see this same fealty to patriotism. And there's actually kind of a complete rejection to patriotism amongst these same folks who are flocking towards Ukraine. So I'm kind of curious what your thoughts are on all of that. If you think it's actually going to come down to, we would need like a physical threat against us, or an actual physical action against us in order for people to start being more patriotic again, or if it's salvageable before it comes to that.
Yeah, I think the unfortunate reality is what you just said, that it takes an actual physical threat, some kind of dramatic crisis, catastrophe, that forces people to do things that they're not naturally inclined to do during, times of goodness and peace and prosperity. We've had a pretty good run since the late 1980s and the collapse of the Soviet Union, that we weren't faced with any kind of existential threat or crisis. In the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, you had kids in schoolrooms across the country that would still do duck and cover drills, in these rehearsals for if we were under nuclear attack from the Soviet Union. I can remember that when I was a little kid, right? So there was this visceral, physical reality of news clips of Soviet Navy flotillas, fleets out there in the oceans, and bomber aircraft in the air, and missile tests and nuclear explosions, in the testing ranges and stuff. It was real. And then after the Soviet Union went away, all that disappeared, right? So we saw a huge outpouring of patriotism in the wake of the attacks of 9/11. I think because it was so emotional. And you saw pictures of people jumping out of windows, the World Trade Center buildings. You saw the smoke coming up out of the Pentagon, and firefighters showing up, and people showing up with plates of cookies and stuff to support the first responders who were really piling in on that stuff. We see something similar when a tornado goes through the Midwest, or a hurricane damages or destroys local towns on the coastline. People are emotionally driven.
Yeah, but we're not seeing Hollywood movie stars raise millions of dollars for the people of Kansas.
Well, no, I agree, but I'm saying that there are these instances, right? So the thing with the Ukraine and Ukrainian flags and all that stuff is it's easy to romanticize that. It's distant. They weren't doing anything against Russia. Russia comes in, and now we see these emotionally heart-wrenching videos of a maternity hospital getting bombed, or a theater in which 400 or 500 people have taken refuge, and a lot of the dead are children. And so it's easier because it's emotionally compelling to kind of want to provide your support. And so you can do that with a flag, or raising funds, or sharing something on social media, but it's not really costing you anything, is it? Right? Are you actually having to pick up a rifle and suffering the risk of engaging a Russian military formation or something like that, right? So I think again, it's emotionally satisfying. There is a social media narrative about Ukraine under attack by these bloody Russians and those sorts of things. But is that different? Obviously it is. Than rising to support your own country in relative times of peace and identifying yourself as a proud American. So where was the American flag, in the lawn or on the outside of that house to begin with? In my neighborhood, you drive around, you see Marine Corps flags from old retired Marine Corps guys, and again, all of a sudden you see American flags, and I've got, a Marine Corps sticker on the back of my vehicle and all that. And my wife, on her car, does have a Ukrainian flag kind of painted on the window, because she understands people fighting for liberty and survival and freedom and all that represents. But that's alongside our American, Marine Corps sticker on the vehicle and her license plate, which is a, kind of a don't tread on me sort of thing. Right. And so, I think for most people, though, it is easy to get kind of caught up in their own daily lives. Living is easy. For the most part, we're not subject to all sorts of threats. And so we can get kind of really loose in our thinking, and get very kind of hyper idealized in our belief systems that just don't really align with reality. I mean, how many people still buy things made in China, knowing that your dollars are going to the Chinese Communist Party and their suppression of the Uyghurs, and all the other things that China does in developing and evolving its surveillance state, So the pocketbook is one thing, things that are emotionally satisfying or something else. And I think it isn't until an actual physical threat comes here to our homeland that we'll see this kind of resurgence of patriotic fervor and having to pick sides, pick a team, about who do you want to support and defend.
Well, I mean, I think you touched on something here. In addition to picking a side, I mean, I think a lot of what we're seeing with this divisiveness in our political culture is actually evidence of kind of this relaxed, more decadent society that we're in, and that we can kind of we have that luxury now of being able to criticize others outside of our own household, and not have to self-reflect so much on kind of what we're doing, but actually kind of reflect on what others are doing. And then kind of making that the priority to us. Right. So,
well, yeah. And I'll interrupt here, obviously, because there's no cost to that.
Right.
You actually derive a benefit. Right.
Right.
The kind of the woke elements of our culture will praise you and make you the corporate CEO, give you tenure at the university, because you're edgy and progressive and you're so enlightened and those sorts of things. So there's no cost to jumping on that bandwagon, and there's everything to gain.
Exactly.
Hollywood awards and these sorts of things. So if it was different, then you would see, I think, a different behavior in the general population.
Oh, I think you're absolutely right. And I mean, kind of taking that to the next level, looking at how our enemies perceive this, right? So obviously we've had entire generations that now have grown up in this kind of more decadent society. And there is like a certain laziness of political fervor attached to it. Like there's not, they're clearly active and passionate about something, but it's in times either misdirected or uneducated, partly because they don't want to do the work to really have like strong convictions or to stand up for what they believe in by actually looking into it and having real facts to back it up and knowing what they're talking about, which is a whole nother, other level of things. But I guess I want to ask you a little bit, and then we can break this down a little bit more too, if you'd like. But just more so when you have countries like China who play the long game, right? Because I think we're about to see 2 presidents in a row that have served like 1 term. I mean, I'm not making any predictions here, but I think that speaks a little bit to the indecisiveness of the United States and where we're at right now, and how we're kind of all over the map. And then you see countries like China who play the long game and who are planning generations ahead and taking advantage of everything that they can in our end. They're manipulating Hollywood. They're investing so heavily in everything in the United States that we actually can't divest from them. If you look at like New York and Chicago and how beholden they are to Chinese money, it's really disconcerting when you're looking at it from a national security perspective, because all of a sudden now our culture is disintegrating. There's this country trying to increase this wedge between our political divide. And then at the same time, they have us tied down to them financially. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on just generally like the weakening of the culture and kind of the laziness and choosing a side, but more how that speaks to the national security concerns with China.
So again, it's going to kind of sound weird in my response, but I can relate this, let's say, to a military Marine Corps infantry battalion. All right.
Mhm.
So during time of peace, I could take the makeup of that battalion and we could make it look exactly like the diverse society we have in the United States. That if I had, again, 500 infantrymen or something like that, how many of them are women, how many of them are men, Black, Hispanic, Asian, Polynesian, old white boys, those sorts of things. And we could make it look like that by adjusting standards or just dictating that's what it looks like, right? I won't know what the effectiveness of that unit is until it's actually subjected to combat. And then I find out who can carry a fellow Marine, who can, load artillery rounds into, a piece of artillery, the physicality and all those sorts of things. So my point is that based on the history of warfare and what has been demanded of infantry units and what has performed well, I have a sense as to the goodness or badness of that idea, fabricating what it might look like. But I can't prove to you because the battlefield is someplace in the future, right? And so it's kind of this speculative, my warning based on my read of history, but this is a future event that may never occur. So we can continue to kind of make excuses and impose our own desires on whatever that organization looks like. Okay, so using that kind of as an example, now we look at city governance. Let's look at what has transpired in cities like Baltimore and St. Louis and Chicago and San Francisco and all, with the political leadership and the policies that have been in place. Defund police, right? And ignoring small level crime, releasing people with no bail or very, very early, with little bail, sorts of things. Because we're able to make excuses and there aren't any severe consequences immediately. People base their spending decisions on how much money they have in their wallet at the moment, right? Whether they can extend that on credit so the payment is pushed off to some far distant place in the future, because everybody seems to live in the now without regard to where that will likely lead on down the road. If I live my life a particular way and it turns out that I'm penniless, I don't have health insurance, I'm a physical wreck, I've got no solid, family relationships because I estranged everybody and was abusive and all that stuff. Well, that's, 30, 40, 50 years down the road, and now it's too late, So we don't see these consequences up front because we have little sense of history and a little sense of, again, an appreciation for kind of this civic good, picking a team, identifying as a country, and why that takes time to build and why you have to maintain that over time. Because 30 or 40 years from now, right, we will need that cohesive, unified country or family or local community that has been based on a set of principles that over millennia have proven themselves to have of an enduring sort of good. So a country like China, for example, like I said, not a whole lot of immigration, right? If you're not Han Chinese, then you're not going to work out in our society. You're not going to get, entrance into the Chinese Communist Party and stuff. And so they can kind of dictate how things are going. And they do have these longer term objectives, getting their students into our universities, baiting or tantalizing American companies with access to the Chinese market, which you'll never fully get anyway, right? But there is that very in the now desire to get the corporate profit, in this quarter or in this fiscal year, as opposed to something 10 years down the road, right? And so we have had the luxury of kind of, wallowing in our own self-absorbed, ideologies. And does that make sense?
No, it makes a lot of sense. And part of me is starting to wonder, and I know this would open a whole new can of worms, is how much of this is due to like government programs and like the federal government basically holding everyone's hand and saying, oh, you don't have to prepare for the future. We got you. And then that's kind of like what the progressive left is really trying to take us to a full-on version of, right?
You can pick whatever path you want. There are no consequences. And if there are, on the off chance, some kind of negative consequences, don't worry about it. We'll take care of you.
Right. And this is the beginning of Marxist ideology, right? Because at the end of the day, this is what communism leads to, is that you can make any choice you want. You're all going to make the same amount of money. Government will take care of you. We'll figure it out. You just do you.
And see, and the lie is that, well, the rich will pay for this.
Right.
Well, if there aren't any rich, then who pays for it? The answer is nobody, right? There is no free lunch. So we can have all these federal subsidies, all these handouts, all these programs that basically insulates people from poor life decisions, you know, that either they have made or their family units around them have made, right? That in one sense, old Scar from The Lion King was true when he says life's not fair, right? But you can certainly make life a lot better, longer term, and for more people if we just exercised a bit of self-discipline, a bit of self-denial, self-sufficiency, and not expecting that some mythical government, you know, with its bags of money that it prints with abandon, will ignore inflation, will ignore long-term, you know, fiscal viability for the country, just so that you can get the check in the mailbox, right? Now, clearly, are there people who actually need, you know, and deserve, you know, that kind of support? Absolutely. I mean, it's a Christian principle, you know, that people will find themselves in a spot in life, but it's also incumbent upon those people to try to do better for themselves too, you know, work of some type, you know, while you're getting some kind of a government, you know, handout or subsidy or something like that. So we've forgotten those aspects because people find that it is not only possible, it is easy to ascend to positions of power by offering to their constituencies, right, their support base, lots of goods that is free of charge to that particular constituent, right? And we just kind of off-put. So we're freeing ourselves from consequences and responsibility and any obligation by trying to chart as easy a path as possible, which always leads to bad outcomes.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and I think they're taking advantage. I mean, human nature is to kind of go down the path of least resistance, right? So, you know, if you're constantly offered that path, you know, people are, you know, even if we're wise enough to say, okay, we should be hesitant here, you know, the more tantalizing these policies are that are going to be offered up, regardless of how expensive they are, because like you said, we're operating in the here and now, and we're not operating in the future. Like we always talk about, especially conservatives talk about this big national debt, right? That eventually, you know, they're going to come home to roost, and we're going to have to actually pay it off, or there's going to be some sort of like great recession or something attached to it. But yet we keep spending, and we keep allowing politicians to spend. And I don't want to get in a big discussion on debt, but I think it's when something is so far in the future, are so large, like for example, the debt numbers, to the point where it's almost inconceivable to the average person. I mean, trillions of dollars, we don't even know what that actually looks like. We don't know what trillions of dollars looks like. It's so outside of our normal way of thinking about money. So it kind of opens this door for politicians to really take advantage of, not really necessarily the ignorance, but just kind of the inability to conceive, right? Like we can't conceive of these ideas because it's not something that we tangibly see on a regular basis.
Yeah, I mean, I wish I could remember the name of the college, but in the news headlines here the last couple of days, for some
Yale. Or are we talking about Yale, or are we talking about something else?
I don't know, but it was like a master's program, a master's degree in happiness or something.
Oh, okay, that's not the one I'm thinking of. But
you know, so it's one of these things where I can take out a student loan that I won't have to pay for 10 years from now, and I can use my academic time sitting in a classroom, you know, getting a degree in happiness. Okay, well, how does that translate into any kind of productive, you know, profession? You know what I'm saying? I guess
I
the professor is teaching that, but it's just, you know, wanting to avoid pain, any kind of difficulty, any kind of challenge, wanting to avoid, you know, picking a team or a side or a country, because you ultimately have to come back to making a decision, you know, and taking position on a particular issue. And oftentimes that encumbers you in some way, right? That you have to affect some level of self-denial, or, you know what I'm saying?
I mean, if you refuse to make a choice, I mean, we talked about how the students with tyrannical pensions are going to take advantage of that. And that's just general in general in life, like if you're not going to pick a side and you're going to be, complacent and keep your head down, others that are picking a side will take advantage of you and will manipulate your environment entirely to fit their ends. Right. So I think I want to bring this back to the concern with China, because again, this is like the paranoid self, and that when I look at like social media and I see these videos, you talked earlier about how kind of the younger generations operate as if there's no consequences in life. And, you look at these kind of videos that are popular on TikTok and Instagram or what you're seeing on social media, and kids are just kind of running around, like doing random things as if there's no consequence. You've heard of kids who've like killed themselves trying to take selfies in really extreme places, things like this. There's no like concept of, maybe we should be doing something more productive with our time, but also the things that we're doing right now are kind of ridiculous and not self-serving, and they don't really contribute to society at all. There's no thinking at all in that regard.
Well, yeah.
But I want to know, I want to know like what your thoughts are on whether or not with how China is looking at everything and how they want to, it's in their interest that American culture disintegrates, right? And that our political divide is widened. So how do you think they manipulate not only like our social media apparatuses, but like Hollywood, movies, everything that we see as a society? How do you think China's involved in that manipulation effort? And you feel free to like completely say that they're not, but I mean, I feel like they absolutely are.
Internal, it's fear and intimidation, right? So if you say anything on any of the social media that is allowed in China that is in any way critical of the regime, the Chinese Communist Party, or the the government there, then you have a social credit score that is lessened. That you take a hit to that. So you can't get a job, you can't travel outside of the country, you can't travel inside the country, papers with you. Maybe your husband or wife or your parents suffer some kind of consequence. So this surveillance state of looking at everything that you do, where you go via closed circuit televisions, your banking transactions, your associations, either in person or social media, who you communicate with, all of that is surveilled. It's all inventoried, and cataloged. And it used to be difficult to do that in the past because it was people writing down notes on 3x5 cards and maintaining files. Today, electronically, it's all there, and it just goes into just a giant data set. And using various algorithms, the better computers get, and the evolution of artificial intelligence, all this is automated. And so you can crank out reports or start detecting trends and patterns in the blink of an eye, right? So that goes on inside of China. Outside of China, they make it as easy and seductive and pleasurable, right, and profitable as possible. So huge checks in the form of grants to universities to do certain types of research, as long as you have Chinese students that are involved in that. TikTok videos. I mean, who doesn't love to watch a TikTok video? So people are posting things on social media, your various chat groups, the running chats that you'll have while you're doing some kind of a multiplayer game online. All that is recorded, okay? And it sounds like it's kind of a paranoid sort of thing, but it's not. Once you post something on the web, it is there permanently. You'll see, that who was it? There was some appointee coming in under the Biden administration who was deleted. It's going to be a staffer for the vice president, right, Kamala Harris, who's deleted something like 10,000 tweets, right, because she has said things in the past that were hypercritical of various people and whatnot. And so the permanent record on the web is there were a certain number of tweets on one day. A week later, there are 10,000 fewer tweets, right? So once you put something out there, even if you think that you've deleted it, right, that record is still in place. So the whole point here now today with youth is they live in the moment, and there's no perspective of time, right, or endurance or enduring sorts of capabilities. So when some of these kids come out of college and they want to get a job with some employer, or whatever, a law firm or a health agency or whatever that might be, today companies go back and look at your social media, right? And we've seen with Supreme Court nominees, going before the Senate, for testimony and stuff. Who were you with and what did you say 25 years ago? So to say that this is some fanciful notion is just not the case. So how China will leverage this is to make the gaming, the economic opportunities, the pleasures of life very, very easy to obtain at no cost. I mean, does anybody pay anything, to use social media or TikTok or something like that? When somebody's paying for that, and what you're doing is you're providing your social media insights into your personal life, your views and attitudes, and that is banked in some massive database and can be used at some future point to try to coerce or leverage or shape or reframe various issues. And I think people just don't have that kind of an awareness because, again, no existential threats, no appreciation for the dangers of this kind of very laissez-faire, living in the moment sort of lifestyle.
Yeah, and I worry about just like so talking to students, one thing is that has become abundantly clear is that the far left knows that what's online is permanent. Not only do they constantly look and search people's old Twitter accounts and try to call people out on things, but they kind of started this doxing concept, right? Like they know that if, for example, I've talked to some students, conservative students, who I feel really bad for them because, just because they held a very mainstream position on something, what would be considered pretty normal, or they just didn't want to get involved with more political issues on their campuses. The woke students or the woke mob on their campus would start tweeting about them or attacking them on social media and saying, this person's a racist, this person's a bigot. And if that person chooses not to respond or they don't want to get involved, all of a sudden now there's an entire record on social media of them being a racist bigot, but there's nothing to counter that narrative, right? So
it carries into the classroom and scoring of papers or getting
and then the employers will look someone up, say they you're applying to law school or you're applying for a job, and then like you said, they all use social media, and the left knows that they do this. So then they're gonna see an entire record of you having all of this baggage of whether or not you are a racist or a bigot. They know that that's coming along. This accusation is coming along with hiring you or bringing you into that law school. So it could be very controversial, and it could actually weigh significantly into whether or not you get the job or you're accepted. So the question goes down to kind of if this is already a tactic that's being utilized by the woke mob, and all of these students are going to graduate one day, right? So we've seen, for example, I brought up Yale Law School just a minute ago because we see at Yale, there was a protest. There was a perfectly sanctioned debate through Federalist Society, and that it had the left and the right represented, right? You had someone from Alliance Defending Freedom, which is a more conservative legal organization, so it's not like a crazy, wild far right thing. And then you had someone from kind of a progressive legal organization to debate on what they could find in commonality with religious liberty. I think that was the topic. But then you had all the Yale students kind of stand up and protest to the point where the event couldn't move forward. And but these were law school students, and everyone's kind of like, oh my gosh, now it's happening in law schools. And my response is, of course it's happening in law schools. The undergraduates graduate at some point, and then they go to law school and then they go to medical school. Then they go to all of these postgraduate programs, or they enter the workforce, and they bring all of their tactics and their methodologies with them and their immaturity as well. So my point in going on this tirade, of course, is to ask you more about what you think about these folks entering the tech world, right? Because they're all going to graduate. A lot of them will probably enter tech fields of some sort because that's kind of the new up and coming job source. They're going to enter the tech field. They're going to be able to stalk, dox, and do weird things with other people's accounts that they don't like through Twitter and social media accounts, or they'll enter the intelligence agencies, or they'll work for the NSA at some point. What are they going to do with all of having access to everyone's records and phone calls? And, what are they going to do with all this information?
Yeah, it's a danger. Code doesn't write itself. So we'll talk about algorithm. Algorithm is just a program. It's a set of rules, if then, or if I see this term, this is how I interpret it or whatever. Somebody is writing that code. So if the software code writer carries with them a particular bias, is one term inflammatory as opposed to a different term. So when you type in a search query and you're using Google as your search engine, the software that generates whatever those responses are, what would come back as results, has been framed in some way by the people who who run that search engine, who write those rule sets and govern, why something gets a higher score than something else, right? And, same thing, if you're working in the intel community, you can see a piece of what we call raw intel, two people meeting or military exercise occurring or a purchase of a raw material or something like that. Well, how do you interpret that? Is that a danger or is it nothing to be concerned about? Well, it comes from the perspective of the analyst looking at that. Exactly. And so if you want to view China as just a rising, economic partner who's trying to find their place in the world, and you don't want to characterize it as an actual threat to the United States and our interests, then how you interpret that raw data and write it up in a report, and it goes up the chain, to the president or whomever it might be, will carry that particular viewpoint. And we saw this during the Obama administration, where they shifted from basically a two-war capability or capacity doctrine, where the U.S. military needed to be big enough to handle two major contingencies near simultaneously. So if you had something like Ukraine and you had to surge U.S. forces to Europe, you would also have enough residual force to maintain a presence in the Indo-Pacific because of alliance obligations with Japan or South Korea. Well, you did that because you viewed in the past China as an actual military challenger, and you viewed Russia as an actual military challenger. Well, the Obama team comes in, they wanted to save money instead of spending on defense, so they use that for green energy programs and other sorts of domestic social policy agenda items. So they redefined China as not being a threat, but as an economic partner, right? So it's these are people redefining problems so that the problem is no longer a problem. And then if you follow that logic, you can change defense investments, or you can change your diplomatic outreach, how we engage with the world. China would view that as a huge win because it gives them freedom then, to do the things that they were going to do anyway. I don't have to be worried as much with a strong U.S. military because it's been weakened by executive direction from the White House itself. And so it opens up more opportunities for China, to do what China was going to do. I mean, does that make sense?
No, that makes perfect sense.
So your point. So if you're carrying a political or social philosophy with you as an individual, you get in the IT sector, what search results, how do we define news? Who is going to wind up on a bad list, as an extremist because of what they posted to a social media site, how that's interpreted by the people who wrote the code, who then drive, sorts of results to various authorities, right? And so it has everything to do. The youth coming up out of school systems really have to be broad-minded enough to understand the long-term consequences and the fact that, as you just pointed out, these college campus situations, people are picking sides. Yeah. And so if you don't rise up in defense of conservative values and true freedom of speech, then the left is going to dominate you, denigrate you, and deny, these sorts of free speech, open speech kinds of forums, so that their policy agenda is pushed forward without any contest whatsoever, right? And that same attitude carries up into service in the commercial sector, private sector, and in government service as well.
No, I think that's actually a great note to end on. Thank you so much, Dakota, for joining Well Said today. Well Said is a bi-weekly live show where I interview policy experts, commentators, academics, and students on various topics of higher education, free speech, and related topics on American culture and policy. You can share this episode on Facebook or YouTube. Also, you can share the podcast on Apple, Spotify, Anchor, or download it anywhere you get your regular podcasts. Give us a 5-star rating if you like what you heard today. I'm Cherise Trump, and Dakota, that was Well Said.
Thank you.